Everyone, thanks so much for joining us. So first of all, the UNC Greensboro community has historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Kiawe and Sora, and we honor and respect the many Indigenous peoples connected to the land where we gather today. So I'm really excited today to welcome Dr. Gwen Robbins Schug, who is a professor of anthropology at Appalachian State University in Boone, and also a visiting professor here at UNCG from 2020 to 2022. Her research focuses on adaptive challenges for human communities, including human environmental interactions and climate change throughout the Holocene in South Asia, and more recently in Bronze Age Oman and modern Italy. Her work has been funded by Wenner Gren, Fulbright, and the American Institute of Indian Studies. She is the editor of the Routledge Handbook of the Bioarchaeology of Climate and Environmental Change, which was just published this year, and is also co-editor of A Companion to South Asia in the Past, author of Bioarchaeology and Climate Change, and 33 published journal articles and book chapters. She currently serves as a co-editor-in-chief of the journal Bioarchaeology International and as an academic editor of PLOS ONE. Dr. Robbins Schug teaches a bioarchaeological field school at the University of Padua in Italy, and she is currently teaching courses at UNCG on climate and human health in the past, the history of disease, human skeletal biology, and forensic anthropology. Dr. Robbins Schug is also mother to 4 children, 3 dogs and 2 cats, and will be welcoming her first grandbaby in February. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Gwen Robbins Schug.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Sean, for inviting me to give this talk today. I'm really excited to be able to share my research and the research of many of my colleagues, and to talk with you about what studies of the past can tell us about equitable, sustainable development in the future, and specifically studies of human skeletal remains from the past. So I'm a bioarchaeologist, and we use archaeological human remains as a source of evidence about past people's experiences, their lifestyles, their health, and the way that past people adapted to things like climate change. That's been my main research focus, is looking at periods of climate and environmental change in the past and thinking about how human groups, their sociocultural circumstances and historical trajectories for different human communities create variation in their responses to a changing environment. And then I've also recently been thinking about how to use this knowledge to combat some of the environmental determinism that we find in the popular literature about climate change, and particularly involving societal collapse and the determinist narratives that are commonly underlying policy and planning discourse and decision-making. So that is basically what I want to talk with you about today. So there's no doubt that we live in a warming world, and that climate change is a very significant and important challenge facing human communities today. On Thursday, May 9th in 2013, we passed 400 parts per million carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere, and that's a level that has not been seen on Earth since the Pliocene, which, as most of you know, I'm sure, is an epoch that lasted from 2.4 to 5.4 million years ago. And this is when the genus Homo first evolved. So as we begin to experience the early impacts of global warming, the global public is becoming increasingly aware of climate change. And in a sense, it's become particularly alarming because there's a lot of uncertainty about what warmer temperatures are going to mean in terms of storm activity and disasters, our food and water supply, disease patterning, and really, just life on Earth. Excuse me. For decades, as you know, I'm sure, there's been a straw man debate that has been raging in the public sphere as to whether climate change is real or whether it was caused by humans, And while this public controversy has prevented an organized and effective response to climate change by the US government, at the same time, behind the scenes, our governmental agencies, which are responsible for things like managing our natural resources or monitoring our national security priorities, they've begun planning for a warmer world. In 2015, Congress tasked the Department of Defense with identifying the most serious and most likely climate-related risks for military operations. They asked them to develop mitigation plans for humanitarian aid, global security, capacity building in partner states, like disaster capitalism kind of stuff, and sharing best practices. And they also asked them to describe their resource needs to conduct these operations. And the Department of Defense issued this report, The National Security Implications of Climate Change, which defined global climate change as an urgent and growing threat to our national security, contributing to increased natural disasters, refugee flows, and conflict over basic resources such as food and water. And the Department of Defense claimed in this document that the impacts of global warming are already being experienced, of course, and that the scope, scale, and intensity of these impacts are projected to increase over time. And the document as a whole, if you were to go and read it online, belies a philosophical orientation that the United States needs to project power and win decisively, as the increasing risk of instability and conflict overseas creates challenges to our national interests. So the Department of Defense and the EPA and these other planning bodies rely on something called the human security literature as the basis for their views about what kinds of challenges we'll face in the context of global warming. And this field of inquiry, the human security field, started out as a sort of quest to define human well-being and the concept of vulnerability and how weak or failed states were unable to meet basic human needs. And in the last decade of the 20th century, they sort of shifted their focus after the Cold War kind of ended to the issue of climate change. And despite warnings from some fringe members of this field of inquiry, including a few interloper anthropologists, that the field was becoming overwhelmed by modernist, neo-Darwinian, and ethnocentric perspectives, their concern with human well-being in the face of climate and environmental change has become largely focused on some basic principles. And in their view, human nature is inherently, deeply, essentially, biologically violent, that climate change always leads to environmental migration, and that in turn leads to increased competition for resources, and civilizational collapse is often or inevitably the result. So unfortunately, anthropology is almost entirely neglected in this scholarship, despite its inherently anthropological topic. The scholars in the human security field do not typically cite the work of anthropologists or archaeologists. Oh, sorry, someone's texting me. Even though we've been working on human environmental relations for millennia, they don't read biological anthropology or human evolutionary theory. And instead, they're reading people like Jared Diamond, Steven Pinker, and other popular authors who write very highly sensationalized books with titles like Climate Wars, Why People Will Be Killed in the 21st Century. And in a recent analysis of this literature, I found it very frightening that Jared Diamond was the major source of information about the collapse of past societies. The reason it's so alarming is that Jared Diamond is famously wrong about the collapse of past societies. But this is what they're reading. And this is where they get their information about anthropology. And in light of their view that America should be prepared to dominate at all costs in the face of global warming, it becomes imperative that anthropologists address some of the misconceptions that people like Jared Diamond and Steven Pinker have promoted about human nature and what climate change really means for human populations. So there are some scholarly books wherein archaeologists and bioarchaeologists have directly addressed some of the misconceptions about the collapse of past societies, and some of them have specifically addressed claims that Jared Diamond has made. But these books are typically not for a popular audience or even a broadly educated audience. They're more focused on questioning the idea usually that societies will collapse at all, questioning the concept of collapse or its definition, and demonstrating the character of resilience in human communities through time. So in the past few years, I've been working with a community of bioarchaeologists, some of whom are here, and we've begun writing about variation in human responses to climate and environmental changes, a variation in health and other long-term outcomes in different regions of the world over time. So just as the ability to understand physical processes of global warming rely on paleoclimatic reconstructions, predictions about human behavior and sociocultural change must rely on historical sciences as well, and social sciences like archaeology, where we've been conducting research on human environmental interactions for decades. So bioarchaeologists, which I am one, and as I mentioned, we're a type of archaeologist who specializes in using human skeletons from archaeological sites as a source of evidence about these past challenges. And one thing we know is that climate change is already having an impact on global public health, human security, including food and water security, migration flows, and bioarchaeologists have a really unique role to play in understanding past climate change because we bring an anthropological perspective to this work. And really, we're focused on a biocultural approach, which recognizes a basic interconnectedness of human biology with culture. So for humans as a species, we are a biocultural organism. And our work also focuses primarily on human variation. And that's a critical component of combating environmental determinism. So human health is, of course, one of the major areas of concern for climate scientists and the public policy and planning community, because anthropogenic climate and environmental changes are occurring at a scale and magnitude that are unprecedented, of course, in human history. And they're already posing a significant threat to human health and well-being, both in terms of direct effects like changes in temperature or precipitation, extreme weather and climate events, ecological disruption, reduced food production, altering the habitat of disease vectors, social responses to climate change, migration, and refugees, but also in terms of things like morbidity and mortality from these ambient temperatures and intense heat, the higher risk of undernutrition, health consequences of disrupted work, air pollution, higher risks of food and water and vector-borne diseases. And so there are really important research gaps that remain, particularly in low-income countries. Paleopathologists, as bioarchaeologists who are focused on a long-term perspective on human health, are a really critical part of understanding health in the past in the face of climate and environmental change. And a lot of bioarchaeologists are already doing this work, particularly if we think about the 17 priorities for research on global sustainable development that were defined by the UN in 2015. They specifically called for scientists and other scholars to please engage with specific topics and research questions that are outlined in this paradigm that they laid out. And many of those topics, as I said, are things that we're already doing research on. We're already working on topics that yield insights into the longue durée of specific health and well-being questions that are being posed by these policymakers. Subsistence transition or dietary change, dietary diversity, biocultural stress or disruptions to homeostasis, the concept of health, urbanism, industrialization, air quality, and so on and so on. The problem is, of course, that policymakers are not reading our literature. That's number one. And number two, our literature often is not really framing the problem in a language that they can understand. So one of my major goals at this point is to bring insights from bioarchaeology to a broader audience of scientists, policymakers, and other educated citizens. So how are bioarchaeologists addressing these research priorities? Well, to take a few examples, research priority 3, good health and well-being. What falls under this rubric of research priority 3? Well, half of the human population alive today does not have access to adequate medical or health services, and maternal, infant, and child mortality is still a major challenge for life expectancy rates around the world. Air pollution, inadequate food and water sanitation, and other challenges of living in a modern urban community lead to occupational and mental health risks. And many diseases that we thought to be a thing of the past are re-emerging as potent problems in this context. Emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases like tuberculosis, malaria, other neglected tropical diseases, insect-borne diseases, these all represent major challenges for a warming world with increasing frequency and severity of natural disasters combined with overpopulation, overcrowding, and millions living in impoverished conditions, as well as increasing antibiotic resistance. So for example, there are certain epidemiological patterns that bioarchaeologists are familiar with and have described, which characterize moments across human history when communities have settled down in crowded sedentary villages and/or began relying on food production or experienced industrialization. And currently we're at the beginning of one of these epidemiological transitions, the third transition, in which increased sedentism, obesity, and reliance on technology are contributing to a rise in degenerative diseases. We're also in a period when these emerging and re-emerging infections are changing human disease ecology. So one example of how bioarchaeologists are working on these issues is this paper by Charlotte Roberts from 2021, where she describes how climate and environmental changes exacerbate health challenges during periods of climate and environmental change, particularly related to air pollution and maxillary sinusitis and other infections. Other goals that are outlined by the UN's Sustainable Development Priorities include addressing inequality, poverty, and hunger. So climate change obviously is going to impact human communities differently based on their different historical trajectories, culture, and social environments. And bioarchaeologists and paleopathologists already consider the impact of social conditions in the past: inequality, urbanism, migration, culture contact, and new economic and political forms in the modern era, such as the invention of private property or the invention of mental health care or mental health problems on local biology, human health, and well-being. So health can be constrained in important ways by unequal social positioning, and that's something that bioarchaeologists already work on. So for example, a paper that I published with my colleague Ken Nystrom in 2021 demonstrates how to sort of powerfully combine evolutionary theory, biocultural theory with political economy, critical medical anthropology, and other critical social theoretical frameworks to create this deeply contextualized view of contemporary anthropogenic climate change, as well as human agency, resilience, and suffering across the millennia of human environmental interactions. And so we talk specifically about evidence for drought and famine in the past, ecosystem-mediated impacts on infectious disease prevalence, socially or institutionally mediated impacts of occupational hazards, population displacement, conflict, trauma, and nutritional insufficiency, all within the context of social inequality through time. Another priority in the Sustainable Development Goals is life on land. This refers to a goal of promoting healthy relationships with the natural environment and with other species. And one of the ways that bioarchaeologists are working on, there are many different ways we work on this problem, but one of those is looking at endemic diseases in the past that involve our relationships with other species. Paleopathologists and bioarchaeologists consider our entanglements with other organisms and how modifications to the landscape or the ecosystems that we inhabit can influence, constrain, or provide unique opportunities for our communities that are facing climate and environmental change. So recently, bioarchaeologists have been looking at evidence for thalassemia, which is a long-term adaptation to malarial environments and vector-borne diseases. My colleague, Sean Halcrow, has found that these environments were associated with really high neonatal mortality as well, suggesting perhaps that placental malaria was operating as a pressure on communities in the past. And then finally, one of the priorities that we're working on is peace, justice, and strong institutions. And in this case, anthropologists' role is really more to get involved with critiquing notions of the benefits of strong state-level control, unproblematized love of social institutions, and the continuing predominance of capitalist modes of thinking found in policy and planning circles. It's a commonly held view in the global development and policy planning world that climate change is going to lead to these increased migration flows, and that competition for limited resources will result in increased levels of violence, as I mentioned. The reality is that violent responses to instability, economic and political instability, are also likely in cases where social institutions are intact, but they were built upon a foundation of social inequality, injustice, and deprivation. So violence and migration are not always a response by human communities to climate and environmental change, but those responses become actually more likely in the face of strong institutions that are built on social inequality. So violence is not a natural outcome for humans. And some of my colleagues, Deb Martin and Ryan Herod, or Leslie Gregorica, I think she was here earlier, I'm not sure if she's still here, but their work has demonstrated that human responses to climate and environmental change are very varied, and violence can result in a context of climate and environmental change, but it's really more a result of the specific historical, cultural, and social circumstances, as well as ideological phenomena that promote this behavior over alternatives. So my research on Indus bioarchaeology in India and Pakistan in the second and third millennium BC tells us something about how some of these challenges to equitable, sustainable development have played out in the past. And so I want to talk a little bit about my own research, just for a few moments here. So Indus civilization encompassed over 1 million square kilometers of India and Pakistan, beginning in the third millennium BC. And the civilization was built in the context of a semi-arid climate, but they also experienced something called the 4.2 Ka climate change event, when monsoon rains were disrupted and unpredictable conditions prevailed, where there was unpredictable rainfall, conditions were getting drier. And for the first 200 years, this seems to have promoted immigration to urban areas. So folks would come from far and wide, move to these cities, which grew to as large as 20 to 40,000 inhabitants. And people were coming from as far away as southern Mesopotamia. But after about 200 years of climate change, and perhaps more importantly, a lot of disruption to the long distance exchange network that this civilization was built upon, it seems that most of these cities were depopulated. And the human population reorganized on a kind of massive scale around 2000 to 1900 BC in what we typically would think of as a civilizational collapse. So at the city of Harappa, where I work, there was a small population of people who remained behind. And so I've done some work on the bioarchaeology of skeletal remains from the urban period, as well as folks who were living during the transitional period and the post-urban period, after this kind of climate change and political and economic change caused this depopulation of this area. So my colleagues and I have looked at hundreds of skeletons from 3 different burial areas at Harappa, as well as other sites in the Indus civilization, in an attempt to characterize this transition. So we have a cemetery from the urban period, which is cemetery R37. We have a cemetery from the post-urban period. This is R37, post-urban period, cemetery H, and a transitional period known as area G, where there's a small ossuary and about 23 individuals were buried. It's not a formal cemetery, although the nature of this specific assemblage is a little bit unclear. So we did an analysis of interpersonal violence in the human skeletal material from these three areas. And that demonstrated that the risk of violence was pretty low in the urban period, despite climate change. I mean, there was climate change drawing people to the city at that time, this 4.2 Ka event. And despite the increasingly large and extremely heterogeneous population. So there was not a tremendous amount of interpersonal violence, despite the claims that the human security literature makes that those are the drivers of violent behavior. However, during the disintegration phase, when this Area G cemetery was in use, we find a very large increase in the prevalence of traumatic injuries. So 50% of the crania present in that assemblage are affected by cranial trauma, as well as a higher prevalence in the cemetery H, which is from the post-urban period. So at that point, 38% of folks affected. And these injuries were primarily depression fractures, and they're not limited to the city of Harappa. There's also evidence for healed injuries at other Indus cities, Mohenjo-Daro, Kalibangan, Lothal, Rakhigarhi. There are many other Indus cities with evidence for traumatic injuries. We also found evidence for leprosy and tuberculosis in the city cemeteries, as well as in the assemblage at Area G. The most interesting thing about the evidence for interpersonal violence and infectious disease is that it was most prevalent in that transitional period where the cities were becoming abandoned, like folks were leaving in large numbers. There's evidence in the archaeological record for what they refer to as a lack of social control. So rather than cities, they were very organized, built on a grid, they were very clean, and sanitation was a huge priority in the urban period. And what we see in the transitional phase and into the post-urban period is an abandonment of a lot of that, what we think of as like social control or organization. And instead we find, sort of haphazardly arranged settlements, an increase in middens or trash being left around the city, and this disruption to the mortuary treatment that we typically find, where instead of burying folks in cemeteries, they were then at that point being buried in an ossuary, a pit of bones outside the city. And there's increasing evidence for interaction with the dead, where you can see here, there's a skeleton lying in a prone posture, so on its stomach, and the cranium from the skeleton is lying next to it. And there's evidence for decapitation. There's also evidence for men, women, and children's skulls being piled in this area. So there's an increasing amount of interaction with the dead, an increasing amount of traumatic injuries to people who, were still alive at the time they were injured, and then also an increasing prevalence of infectious diseases. So it appears that the risk of violence and infectious disease was greatest in people who are in this very marginal burial environment. And that indicates that these risks were structured by social inequality. So not as the human security literature would predict, where climate change inevitably leads to violence and migration and perhaps increased infectious disease. All of those things did not occur during the climate changes of the urban period. When they began to occur was in this post-urban period, as social inequality exacerbated social differences, and as folks were leaving the city, and there was this sort of lack of social control. So the major conclusions then are that there was a very heterogeneous urban population at Harappa. They had a very specific experience of climate and environmental change. Culture contact led to the introduction of new infectious diseases in this urban period. And these kinds of diseases, leprosy and tuberculosis, thrive in marginalized urban communities around the world today. The loss of social control in the post-urban period was associated with an increase in interpersonal violence. Some folks were at greater risk than others. And then as the economic trade network further declined over time, we see an increase in nutritional diseases as well, nutritional deficiencies. So these results are interesting for a variety of reasons, but particularly the Indus civilization was sort of depicted as a rare example of an entirely peaceful urban civilization with no evidence for interpersonal violence. And this turns out to be untrue when you consult the human skeletal material. But also this work demonstrates an experience of resilience, which is very specific to urban communities built on inequality in South Asia in the past that were experiencing climate and environmental change. And it's in contrast to the experience of rural communities. So for many, many years now, over 20 years, I guess, I've been looking at the impacts of climate and environmental change in the rural communities of West Central India during the second millennium BC. So after the decline of the Indus civilization, the next 1,000 years, people moved out into these very small, more rural agrarian villages. And they occupied these areas for another 1,000 years until, again, these villages at around 1000 BC were abandoned in the face of climate and environmental changes. And so I have looked again at human skeletal material that spans this transition. And what we find is that there are very specific consequences for infants and children, particularly in the form of what we might think of today as stunting and wasting. In other words, declines in stature for age, as well as declines in body mass for stature. And when we look at the bone quality for infants and children in the what we might think of as analogous to the post-urban period, the time after these settlements were abandoned, when very small communities of folks remained behind, the experience is one of declining bone mass, declining bone quality, an increase in porosity, and basically evidence for a disruption in homeostasis in these infants and children, whether it's due to diarrheal diseases, infectious diseases, or starvation is not something that we can specifically tease apart. But what we can say is that infants became very stressed as climate and environmental change led to the abandonment of these villages. But this picture looks very different from the urban experience that I just described. So resilience in the rural context suggests that, number one, in both cases, people do not always migrate in the face of climate and environmental change. Oftentimes, for whatever reason, people remain behind, even if that means that mothers, infants, and children suffer from this choice to remain. And that is, throughout most of bioarchaeological literature, the greatest level of suffering will be found in women, infants, and children. But also, climate change does not inevitably lead to competition and conflict. So, more than 1.3 billion people live in India today, and the population is distributed unevenly, with about a third of people living in these massive metropolitan areas, and another 2/3 of people living in rural villages. And like the prehistoric context, the urban centers rely primarily on an exchange economy while rural people are subsisting on rain-fed agriculture from laboring on small family holdings as they were in the past. Like the prehistoric context, but on a more global scale, we're currently facing this period of rapid climate change combined with rapid population growth, urbanism, massive systems of global inequality, and we're currently undergoing that third epidemiological transition that I mentioned, in which we have these emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases, which may be met with widespread antibiotic resistance. So unlike the prehistoric context, the magnitude of our contemporary anthropogenic climate change is much greater. And our opportunities for migration are, of course, going to be restricted and regulated and will be much less than in the past. And we're already seeing impacts to human health and security. So it's absolutely critical that policy and planning communities around the world take an evidence-based approach, and one which is informed by anthropology, so that their predictions about human responses to climate change and the plans that we make for coping with these changes are evidence-based. And what we learn from bioarchaeology is that resilience takes many different forms. And those are based on the historical and sociocultural circumstances, again, of that population. Migration, increased competition, violence, and civilizational collapse are not necessary outcomes, and they're not preordained by human evolution, as the human security literature would suggest. These are just some of the many possibilities. And they often are more likely to result not from the climate changes themselves, but rather from systems of inequality and exclusion from access to basic resources. And what we also know from bioarchaeology is that moments of rupture, such as dramatic climate change, can create spaces for systems of power to become asserted in new ways, or for sociocultural change to occur from the bottom up, right? So it's imperative that we create some intentionality around these changes to create a more equitable future. So for many decades, bioarchaeologists and paleopathologists have been conducting this research and studying phenomena that really will be highly valuable for contemporary planning and policy making, as well as just educated scientists and other audiences to read. And our scholarship really addresses these sociocultural and political dimensions of climate change for the past 12,000 years. Our data allow for more nuanced interpretations of the long-term strategies and the long-term trajectories of human responses that are created by these short-term strategies in human populations when we deal with climate and environmental change. And so we need to frame our research as bioarchaeologists in ways that folks who work in policy and planning can understand, and hopefully make our work more relevant to creating a more sustainable future. And I just wanted to say thank you again to Sarah and the Sustainability Council Lecture and Dialogue Series for the opportunity to talk with you about my research. And thank you to all of the folks who have contributed to my understanding of climate and environmental change in the past, including so many authors who've contributed to the edited volume that I just recently published, some of whom are here, as well as my colleagues in India and Oman and Italy, where I've been conducting my research, all of the folks who've provided mentorship and advice, and who've provided funding. So thank you so much. And I would love to take questions if there are any.
Thank you, Gwen. Everybody can unmute themselves now, if you like. Thanks. Any questions for Gwen? Total silence. Sarah, do you have any questions?
I have questions. Yeah, I was giving other people a chance. Yeah, so yeah, I think this is really interesting and important to inject some evidence into this like sort of dialogue that occurs, given that most of what policymakers and the public know about like ancient civilizations and how they responded to environmental changes does come from this popular literature. So along those lines, I guess my question is what, Jared Diamond and like the other popular authors would refer to as like a civilizational collapse. So where there's like, abandonment of cities and that sort of thing. I guess that's like similar to what you would call like the decline or like the post-urban period in the case of the Indus Valley civilization. So I was just wondering if you could like provide a little more context on like that distinction between like calling it a collapse versus calling it, a decline or these other terms and like why that distinction is important.
Yeah, so this is a great question. So with the Indus civilization, we actually do see something that we would, as archaeologists, refer to as civilizational collapse. Like they went through a very large reorganization. The people who lived in Indus civilization were not from that region necessarily. Like isotopic analyses have demonstrated that most of the skeletons buried in the city were from immigrants, particularly the males. Some of the women were more likely to be local, but the point being that once the economic party was over, a lot of the people who were living there, most of them, or in the other cities, simply went back to wherever it is that they came from, whether it was Mesopotamia or the hinterlands. It's not that, everyone died, which would be like a real misconception about what civilizational collapse looked like. It's more that folks just went back to wherever it is that they came from originally. But, oftentimes the concept of civilizational collapse is misapplied. So for example, with Jared Diamond's work, if you read his books, I'm not like recommending that you buy them, but if you were to read them, you might find ideas about how Easter Island, for example, misused the resources of the islands, and they cut down all of the trees in order to move these giant statues called moai. And in fact, archaeology has demonstrated that that never happened. The moai were actually moved by this rope mechanism where they actually walked down from the hills where they were carved to the coast where they were set up. And many of the trees were probably already gone because when humans colonized the islands, they brought rats with them, and rats would eat the seeds. And so archaeological evidence demonstrates that humans did not deforest the Easter Island. Like that's not actually what happened. The deforestation was occurring over a long span of time in which humans were already occupying the island. And so this whole idea that he, this picture that he paints of, humans misuse their environment, they denude the island, all the trees are cut down, and then they have to start eating babies because they can't make boats and blah, blah, blah. It's completely wrong. And so for people to rely on that literature, I mean, it does paint a picture, or, Steven Pinker, he paints a picture and he specifically states in his book about human violence that humans are inherently, naturally evolved to be violent, and that, civilization isn't given enough credit, and that civilization and statehood and modernity basically tamed human nature. And he uses a lot of cherry-picked examples of violence in prehistory to make his argument. And he leaves out a lot of evidence to the contrary, right? So both of those authors, their science is very flawed. Jared Diamond's not even an anthropologist, I'm sure you know. He actually studies birds. Anyway, so that's not a source of evidence about the past. It's much more varied than the picture that you would have from reading those authors.
Thanks. Yeah, Jared Diamond's actually in a geography department, but we don't want him, so.
Right. Yeah, I wasn't going to say that.
Yeah.
I thought I'd just focus on his that's the thing though, like he's trained in one way and then, you know, suddenly he's an expert on birds and suddenly he's an expert on people and, you know, human history. It's bizarre. Yeah.
Alex has his hand up.
Yeah, so I'll confess I've read Jared Diamond's Collapse. Found it interesting and yeah, this blew my mind a little bit. This was interesting and very informative. The question I've got is I'm wondering if climate change maybe preceded some of the inequality that seems to be more of the driver you found in your research to the decline of some of these civilizations and the outmigration, just in that typically under conditions of climate change, resources diminish and scarce resources often lead to competition. And when there is competition, humans tend to hoard what they can for themselves and their kin. And that creates a heightened sense of inequality. I'm wondering if that kind of does that logic hold up, and is that perhaps a way to link climate change and inequality and some of the outmigration?
Okay, so I'll say a couple of things about that. This is a good question because this is sort of the crux of the issue, right? The first thing I'll say is that in Indus civilization, what we find is that people, almost everyone who was living in these big urban environments had immigrated there. So within the course of like 150 years, the city of Harappa, for example, went from a city of a few thousand people to 40,000 people, right? Within 150 years. So definitely not like a natural fertility increase, right? There's a lot of immigration. And the social inequality begins at the founding of this urban civilization. So in a sense, climate change has something to do with people moving to the city, perhaps, but it's probably much more related to the economic opportunity afforded by this urban civilization, right? Like they were trading with Mesopotamia, indirectly, even as far as the Mediterranean or with Egypt. And so there's a huge amount of economic opportunity afforded here. And it's also a much, perhaps less oppressive environment than rural village life affords, right? So people are moving into the city. The inequality seems to have started there, right? With the climate change, what seems to happen is, you know, everything was fine for the first 200 years. There may have been social inequality, you know, the archaeological records suggest that there was, but we don't see a tremendous amount of violence or infectious disease. A little bit, it starts to happen a little bit. What really spurs those changes is the loss of social control. So as people are leaving the city, the immigration away from the city, that's where we find violence and infectious disease increasing. And it just seems to have been that some folks were at greater risk than others, right? The other thing I'll say about it is that competition for resources and immigration is not a necessary conclusion in the face of climate change. So in Oman, for example, you've got the same climate change event, the 4.2 Ka event, and people were living in much smaller settlements, also participating in the same exchange network, but they're living in these smaller settlements. There's no evidence for any social inequality. And climate change did not lead to either migration or violent behavior or, you know, presumably competition for resources either. Like folks remained in their communities. The communities did not particularly decline in size. And we don't see any evidence for an increase in violence or disease. So it really depends, right? Like the climate change is not really the driver. It's the social and economic and historical and cultural circumstances and the ideology that people possess that drives their responses, right? So if you live in the context of social inequality or urbanism, as we do, it might seem that those are a natural consequence. But when we look at other kinds of societies in the past, the very same climate change event within the very same exchange network, right? The same sort of system, economic system, can have very drastic different impacts, right? Someone in the chat had a question.
Yeah,
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so Katerina says, thank you for this presentation. One question, does your research explore how the people of that time felt or expressed themselves during this time period, such as how they interpreted the situation that influenced their decision to leave or stay?
Yeah, that's such a good question. It's unclear at this point why some people decided to stay behind and other people decided to leave the city. That is something that really requires a lot more research. The excavations that were done at a lot of the Indus cities happened a long time ago. So we're able to get at some of like ideological change. So I'll say one thing about that, which is with leprosy, for example, that's a highly stigmatized disease today, right? And it has been for thousands of years, which we know from historical sources, as well as like the Bible and other religious texts, including the Vedas in India, which were composed in the 2nd millennium BC. So it is a highly stigmatized disease. And what we find at Harappa, that's sort of like the point at which this disease or this pathogen entered the human population there. And so it provides an opportunity for us to explore the origins of that stigmatization. And what we find is when the disease first enters the population, it doesn't appear to be stigmatized. People with leprosy are buried in the same cemeteries. They're buried in the same posture with the same kinds of grave goods and the same orientation of the burial, like everything that we can see about the burial is the same for people, both people who express the disease skeletally. I mean, it has a very significant expression. It's very visible. And people who don't express the disease. So early on, everybody sort of recognized perhaps that this person had an illness. It was very disfiguring, but they were not stigmatized in any way that's visible archaeologically. But that changes over time. So what we find in the post-urban period is people with leprosy are being buried in such a way where they're definitely being marked as different. And it looks like perhaps, maybe, and this is a little speculative because we are dealing with folks who lived thousands of years ago, but if we use the religious texts that were composed around that time as a sort of way of finding common ground, it does appear that perhaps folks were trying to ameliorate the impact of the disease. They would do things like remove the feet of the burials of people with leprosy. So they would still be buried in the cemetery with everyone else in the post-urban cemetery, but now their feet are gone, right? Or at one site called Balatal, there's an individual with leprosy and he was buried under 9 layers of burned cow dung. Cow dung is an extremely purifying substance in India, and perhaps it was at that time. There's not an example anywhere else in India ever of a person being buried in this way. There was a huge stone enclosure built. He was put on top of cow dung, and then these 9 layers were piled on top of him. And so again, it appears like perhaps there was an attempt not to stigmatize people with leprosy, but a recognition that they had this disease and perhaps an attempt to help them in their journey to the afterworld, like despite having this disease. And then shortly thereafter in the archaeological record, we do find stigmatization. So at some point it shifted from, oh, this person is different and requires care in the afterworld, like special treatment, to, oh, this person is polluted spiritually and now, you know, they and their whole family have to be excluded. So a little bit like of evidence of an ideological shift over time, right? And so when I say that climate change opens a space for culture change, it may be that as these cities were abandoned, and folks remained behind, and you had this loss of social control. It opened up spaces for people to think about things differently. And sometimes, you know, crisis can open an opportunity for, or it opens a space for othering, right? It opens a space for some people to be marginalized further. So it could be that that is also a process at work during this time. But those kinds of ideological shifts and like psychological or emotional shifts are a little bit more difficult to get at archaeologically. Sometimes we try with the recognition that some of it is sort of speculative, and we really do have to rely quite a bit on textual sources for that. And so we do have the Vedas, but they were not composed necessarily by Indus people. They just sort of give us a picture of what some people who were writing a religious text felt about the world around them at that time, right? So all of that is sort of a caveat you have to take into consideration when you're thinking about something like trying to understand ideology from archaeology, right?
So we are at 1 o'clock. I know probably some people have, 1 o'clock meetings. So of course, if you have to go, that's fine. There are a couple more questions in the chat. So Gwen, if you have a couple minutes, maybe we can get to those ones.
Sure.
So Etsko asked, it seems your research has great policy implications for city and community building. What are your recommendations for policymakers?
Yeah, I think it's really important for them to take into consideration that people who live in different social and historical circumstances are going to have different responses. So like the question earlier, or like the human security literature, there's this idea that we're always going to have competition for resources, that people are definitely going to immigrate in the face of climate change. And it really just isn't true. So the main barrier to resilience with less suffering, the main barrier is actually social inequality. And I think a lot of policy and planning folks know this, but it is also backed up by archaeology. And so I think it's important to keep pushing these arguments and also to tell these stories, because humans, actually a lot of sociocultural change is accomplished through storytelling. Right? Humans are very much oriented towards storytelling and learning lessons from stories about ourselves, right? And so telling these kinds of stories can be very compelling in terms of getting people to think in new ways about the implications of social inequality, for example. And I think that's the biggest takeaway, is that social inequality is going to exacerbate human suffering in a variety of different ways. They're not always going to look the same either, right? Like in the case of India, you have people in rural villages where you're much more likely to see maternal health suffering. You're much more likely to see infants and children starving or suffering from diarrheal diseases, having these kinds of really severe impacts on their growth and development. In urban communities where there is social inequality, you might be more likely to see immigration and violence and infectious disease causing a problem. But the point being that all of that is going to be exacerbated and made much worse in the face of social inequality. And so that's really where we need to put our efforts. Sustainable development has to be equitable.
Great. So maybe the last question from Mohammed, do you think climate change mediated water crisis may lead to more global refugee crises and human violence?
I think unequal access to water is definitely going to lead to a lot of suffering and violence and many other things. Yeah, violence is not a necessary outcome, right? Even in the face of suffering or immigration, violence is not an inevitable consequence. Humans do not always resort to violence. Our particular society happens to be a very violent one. And so that's typically what we think of as the inevitable response. And people like Jared Diamond or Steven Pinker, they play into that hegemonic discourse so that you feel like that's an evolved response or a natural response. But, you know, the exact opposite is true. Humans are not inevitably violent. We actually see very little evidence of violence in many of the climate change events that we see in the past prior to urbanization and social inequality. Once we hit the Bronze Age and you have a lot of urbanization built on social inequality, then violence is a much more likely outcome. But prior to that, there have been other rapid climate change events like the 8.2 Ka event. We didn't see an uptick in violence at all, or an uptick in migration. There's another scholar that I collaborate with who works on human skeletal remains from folks who survived that transition in the Sahara, where definitely climate change is going to have a significant impact because it's already a fairly marginal environment. Or folks who work in Chile in the Atacama Desert, also, again, very marginal environment to begin with. We don't see any evidence for increased violence in those communities. So it's really not an inevitable result.
Well, that is an uplifting and empowering message. So thank you for that. And thank you very much for the fascinating talk. I learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else did too. So those who are still here, thank you so much for coming. And thank you to Dr. Gwen Robbins Schug.